everybody, it's Courtney and I'm back with another video for Scrappy Tales Crafts, and today I'm going to be using the outlined rose die set. And you can see that we have the solid image as well as the outline. This is what it looks like when it is all cut out. You can see that they just layer up and give you some nice dimension with hardly any work. You can use colored cardstock for this, or you can do some very simple ink blending, but you guys know me, I am going to be using my Copics for this. So I'm going to be coloring both the outline and the solid or background shadow, whatever you want to call it. But in order to make my coloring a little bit easier, I'm going to stick this down to some scrap piece of paper. And I'm just squirting out some Tombow Mono multi-glue on the back of the larger pieces, smearing that around with my finger, letting that dry, and then just smearing a bunch of it on my scrap paper for the small outline pieces. Once the glue is dry, it becomes repositionable. So it will somewhat stick to my scrap piece of paper while I do my coloring, but not become permanent. I can easily peel that off. So I'm just going to lay those down and we are going to begin the coloring. And I kept the coloring super simple. Like I said, you can definitely do ink blending with this. You really don't even have to do any shading if you don't want. But I'm going to start with the stem and leaf image here. And this is the only one, well, there's two of them, but they don't have an outline. It's just one solid image, but you can see that there's quite a bit of detail in it already. I'm just going to kind of boost that up a little bit with some shading. So I went in with my G29, which is my darkest color, and I'm just adding my darkest areas. So on the tips of the leaves and the base of the leaves and a little bit on the stem itself. Then I can blend that out a little bit with the G46, and I'm just using some flicking motions. It does not have to be perfect, and it's gonna look like a hot mess because I'm scribbling right onto the scrap piece of paper as well. But once you peel this up, you'll be able to tell what your coloring actually looks like. So keep going with it. It's going to look terrible. It's going to look messy, but once it's all said and done, it will all kind of come together. So I blended that out with the G24, and then I'm going to finish off with the G21 as my lightest color. Now I can go ahead and peel this off and see if I missed any areas, which I typically do when I color dyes. There's some edges that I sometimes miss, and I just go back in with my marker to fill in those areas. I typically use one of the mid-tone colors just so that it doesn't stand out too much. Now for the flowers themselves, the larger flowers are just the flowers. This bud here is the only one that actually has some leaf or some greens to it. So I'm going to start with the greens, and I'm going to use the same color combination as I did for the previous image. And I'm just adding a little bit of shading. That's it. I'm not adding a whole lot. Again, you can go in with a solid color here, but I did want to make sure that it was different from the actual petals of the rosebud. So once I had my greens in there, then I'm going to take my R89, which is typically what I refer to as my scary dark color when I do blending with reds. But I'm not going to do any kind of blending on these outline pieces. I am just going to color it in solid. So I'm just going to be super careful when I go around the leaves or the greenery area for this particular bud, but I'm just pretty much filling it in. Then I can do the same thing with the larger roses. Again, not doing any shading at all. I'm just using this R89 and I'm just scribbling on the color. Again, you're probably going to miss some areas, especially in between the petals because these are pretty tiny areas, but just scribbling it down. This is just going to be the outline to show where one petal is separated from the other. And I did that with all of the roses. You can certainly use different colors, but I just kept with the reds. Now for the shadow pieces, I am going to do a little bit of shading. I'm going to use the R46 towards the bottom, flick that out with the R24, and then finish off with the R22. I'm a little bit off camera here, but your blending doesn't have to be perfect here because we're going to cover this up with our outline piece. But I did the same thing with all of the outline pieces. And you can see once you have that outline on top of that shadow area, it actually makes the rose come to life with very little effort. So I went ahead and continued all of those, and then I am just going to glue these together. You can see that I do have some white outlined areas there for the outline piece. I just fixed that with that R89 and glued those all together and let those dry. Now I picked a envelope from my stash. If you have a small envelope, you can use it. If you have an envelope die or envelope punch maker thing, you can use that as well. I don't have any of that, so I'm just using a regular old envelope and I'm cutting it down. I'm cutting it down significantly smaller than it actually is, but I'm just making sure that I take equal amounts off of both sides. That way it's still going to look like an envelope. It's still going to have all of the flaps of an envelope, but it's just going to be significantly smaller. Now, I thought this was going to be small enough, but it wasn't. But what you're going to want to do is, because it's going to fall apart, I'm just going to glue that front piece back on, line that up, and then I used a corner punch for the flap of the envelope just so that it wasn't too sharp of a corner, I guess. And once I adhered this down to my card panel, I realized it was still just a little bit too big. So I just did the same thing again. I just took a little bit more off of each side, the bottom, and both of those flaps. And I'm just using the lines on my paper trimmer to make sure that I'm taking an equal amount off of the flap itself. So again, that is centered. Most of it is going to be covered up, so I'm not too concerned about it, but this fits a lot better onto my card panel. Now my card panel is just a piece of black cardstock. You can do, fancy background if you want, but I wanted my roses to be the star of the show, so I kept it nice and simple. So I just adhered my envelope down onto my card panel, and this panel is just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. That way I can have a little bit of a border showing, and I kept my envelope open. What I want to do is make it appear as if my roses are coming out of the envelope. So I'm going to take my roses first and kind of line them up the way I want them. I'm not sticking anything down yet, but remember we have some repositionable adhesive on the back of these. So once you have these lined up, they're going to at least stick a little bit so that they don't shift around as you're getting your placement the way you want it. This is where I realized I didn't have enough stems and leaves. So off camera, I ended up cutting one of the larger stems and leaves pieces and coloring that as well to add that to the right hand side, just to kind of have a little bit more green and actually have a stem for that rose off to the right hand side. So once I'm happy with my placement, I just take a look to see what is on the bottom. So whatever images are on the bottom, they're going to be glued flat down. So I'm just going to lift up little corners here and there, add a dab of glue and stick that down. Again, repositionable adhesive on there, so you want to be careful when you rip these up because you don't want them to fall apart as you're trying to kind of get them off the background. Once I have the images that are flat glued down and they have a minute or two to dry, I'm going to add a little bit of foam tape to the ones that are kind of in front. I want these to be popped up a little bit just to add a little bit extra dimension. I'm just sticking my foam tape on the image or on the envelope itself or on the background itself, I guess, just to make sure that my placement stays the same rather than moving my rose, put the foam tape on there and trying to get it lined up the way I had it before. This is just what makes it easier for me. So once that is done, I can adhere this entire panel down onto my A2 size card base, which, like I said, is just a little bit larger than the panel itself. That way I have a little bit of a white border and it really makes everything pop rather than just having a plain black background, which it still is a plain black background. So to finish off, I am going to use a stamp set also by Scrappy Tales, and this is the a Sweet Bear stamp set. I'm just going to use this small sentiment that says, "All you need is love," stamp that with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and then finally finish off with some shimmer with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen on all of the roses. So that is it. This is a super simple card, and it would be even simpler if I used colored cardstock, but I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.